that here. Okay. All right. Let's go. I've dreaded this moment throughout the whole day because actually talking about Dr. Palmer is quite difficult, and that is because he has done so much. And that's one. And the second, I've been to maybe 5 of his talks throughout my life, and I've seen the struggle my colleagues have had in the past trying to just talk about Dr. Palmer. He's Vice President of Atlas Research Foundation, Atlas Economic Research Foundation. Right? Yeah. He travels all around the world. If you're friendly with him on Facebook, you see him on Monday in Africa, on Wednesday in Asia, and maybe on a Saturday in Bulgaria. I'm pretty sure that most of you have seen the great books that we have next to our reception desk. A lot of you I know are familiar with his work, not just his writing, but also, well, we have YouTube, we've seen the videos. He's not only traveling throughout the world spreading liberty, but he's also really involved with helping people like myself and the whole libertarian crew that has actually made this event possible. Dr. Palmer has been a huge supporter of European Students for Liberty, and now of all the other branches of Students for Liberty throughout the continent, not just throughout the continent, throughout the world. So I think that I should stop somewhere right here, and I would like to ask you to help me welcome Dr. Tom G. Palmer.
Very much for a warm Bulgarian welcome. Am I speaking loudly enough for the people in the back?
Yeah.
It's okay? So no microphone? Good. All right. Well, as Stoyan mentioned, Students for Liberty is really especially dear to me. And I'll explain a bit more at the end of the talk why. But I'll tell you one thing right now. I'm a financial donor to Students for Liberty, so I give a fair amount of money. I'm not rich, but this is an important organization, and I donate every month. There's a little sound at my bank account. This money is sucked out of my bank account, and it goes into Students for Liberty. And that makes me happy because I see how careful they are with my money. They don't waste it. They spend it very wisely and carefully, and I really, really appreciate that as a financial donor. And I'm going to suggest, as a consequence, I was once a student activist, setting up a libertarian club at my university, and now I'm a donor. There might be a pattern for some of you. When you leave university, you get your job, think about €5 a month going to Students for Liberty. Just €5 a month. It's not so much. PayPal, Visa, all kinds of ways to do that. It's painless. And then as you get your raise, make it €10 a month. And then the next raise, €12.50. If we do this, we will generate a base of support that will become very, very dramatic. So that the people who are students in 5 years and 10 years will have the tools and the resources, the books, the videos, the professional colleagues such as Yael, working on behalf of liberty. So that's my little advertisement for you to think in the future about becoming a donor as well, if you go out and begin to earn more money. Now I'm going to talk about the topic of peace. I have this little book out. I've been producing a book a year. Last year I produced 3 books, but a book a year for Students for Liberty in the Atlas Network. This one on the issue of peace, but there were some predecessors. The one we did on the economics of freedom, the morality of capitalism, which is now available in 32 languages, I guess. You can get the Urdu is coming out shortly. Then after the welfare state, which is a topic that should be of great interest to all the young people in the audience, because people of my generation have left you with a tremendous gift, which is called unfunded liabilities and debt. And I'm a little bit ashamed, frankly, that we have not been more successful in stopping this, because this is going to be a very, very big problem for you in the coming years. Then this book, Why Liberty, which was a real pleasure to work on, because the authors, myself excluded, mainly very young people. So they're mainly university students or just out of college for a year. This is really a pleasure to work with them, to help them to find their voice. And then this last book, which I'll talk about the theme shortly. I think this is a very important time for liberals to reclaim the high moral ground of peace. For a long time, the socialists have claimed they're truly the party of peace. It's an absurdity when you think about it, all the socialist states that waged genocide and war over the years. But nonetheless, in intellectual circles, they maintained this aura, this little halo around their heads, that they were the movement for peace. I think it's time to make it clear that's a mistake, and I'll explain why liberalism, classical liberalism or libertarianism or whatever term you want to use, is the peace philosophy, bar none. Now that's a familiar libertarian flag. It's called the Gadsden flag from the struggle of the American colonies for independence. It's fairly clear. Don't tread on me. To tread is to step. If you step on a rattlesnake, it will bite you. And this is how libertarians have often presented themselves. Like rattlesnakes. Step on us and we bite you. But it doesn't really capture the libertarian mentality. It's very partial and inadequate. And in this regard, Students for Liberty has done a better job. It's not just don't tread on me, don't tread on anybody. Don't tread on anyone. So even people who aren't like me, they have rights. And to be a true liberal is to love not only your own freedom, but the freedom of other people. That's harder to do. That takes a moral commitment. It takes the mind and the heart to love the freedom of other people. But that's what is the heart of true liberalism. And when you do that, then you will truly begin to appreciate your own freedom as well, and why it's so precious. Now, we might think about wars. They don't just happen. This is a very important point. Wars don't just happen. They're the result of choices and of ideas. Typically, in a lot of the media, and in most political discussion, they use the passive tense. And then the war broke out. Like the war was a thing in a box and then it got out. This is not true. Or when we read in the news that some people died in a war. I always have to correct myself when I say that. That's not correct. They were killed. They were killed in a war. Or let's take the language now infecting the discussion of police in the United States. Whenever a policeman shoots someone, here's how it's described. There was an officer-related shooting event. And in the police report it says, and then the gun fired. Really? Is that what happened? The gun was sitting there and it shot someone. No. The policeman shot someone. And maybe it was justified and maybe not. That's a factual matter. That's a matter for serious investigation by independent authorities. But the gun did not shoot someone. The police officer did. And then the question was it justified or not? We need to focus on what is happening. Choices are being made. Now, as liberals, we can not only just work for peace, but we can actually focus on those institutions and incentives that make peace or war more or less likely. And this is again another advantage that liberals have in this regard. Institutions matter. Incentives matter. This is one of the things that liberals are focused on that the others, let's say conservatives and socialists, often don't understand. They think it's just about intentions. We understand intentions matter, but there are unintended consequences as well. And to understand unintended consequences, we have to think about incentives for human behavior. Now, when I talk about peace, some people think, oh, what an idealist. No, I'm a realist. And people who are for peace should be understood to be very realistic. These are realistic matters. It's about facts, it's about logic, and it's about evidence. And I'll be going over some of that in a moment. Now, this first point, though, wars don't just happen. They're not like tornadoes or lightning. Lightning struck. Wars do not strike. States strike, military strike. People kill other people. But it's fundamentally different from natural occurrences like thunder or lightning or tornadoes. These are the results of choices and ideas, or we might say ideologies. They're ideologies of conflict and violence. I'll talk about some of them in a moment. What is war? It's organized human violence. I remember a discussion I had many years ago with the Rear Admiral of the United States Navy, named Jean Larac. And he was very direct and very blunt. And this is how many people in the military talk. If you talk to real military people, not the politicians, but most military people don't like killing other people. They're sent to do that by politicians. When you talk to them, the ones who really have to do it, they don't boast about it. They don't brag about it. Here's what he told me. He said, our purpose is to kill the enemy and destroy his ability to harm us. It's what we do. We're not very good about teaching 8-year-old children how to read and write. We don't teach civics. We're not very good at building civic institutions. We don't build bridges very well unless you want to drive a tank across it. What we do is we kill the enemy and we destroy their ability to harm us. And if you need that, call on us. Otherwise, don't. And an example of a politician who did not understand that was the inappropriately named Secretary of State of the United States of America, Madeleine Albright. The little joke, she was Madeleine Half-Bright. Just as a side, she once said in the debate in the United Nations over sanctions on Saddam Hussein's government, she said, after all, we're not the ones with these weapons of mass destruction. Yes, you all get the joke. She seemed unaware that the government she represented had more weapons of mass destruction than all the rest of the planet combined. She didn't know that, apparently. Well, she said to General Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States military, what's the point of this big military you keep talking about, that's his job, by the way, if you don't use it? And he recounted in his autobiography, he said, I almost had a heart attack. To hear a member of the cabinet, the Secretary of State, say something so primitive. What's the point of the military if you don't use it? His point was, the point is not to have to use it. You don't want to use it just because you have it. And typically, most people in the military do understand this. When you want to find real warmongers, they usually don't wear uniforms. They wear civilian suits. They're in politics. So when I talk about peace and being against militarism, it doesn't mean I'm hostile to anyone in the military. There's a big distinction there. The most bloodthirsty people are usually the ones who've never had to carry a firearm and never had to use it. The ones who have usually are much more cautious and don't like it. Now, there's something else that's killed in war as well, and that's freedom. Freedom is the victim in war that most people don't talk about. If you think about it, some of the elements of the contemporary war on terror that's being waged by various governments, one victim has been your privacy and your rights. The United States government has spied illegally against the Constitution, against the laws of Congress. And with Mr. Snowden, when I first learned what he did, I was neutral. I said, I want to learn more. And the more I learned, the more grateful I was to Mr. Snowden. Because what he revealed was illegal behavior. That the administration, the presidential branch, had broken the law on point after point after point and lied to us about it. Not only lied to me as a citizen and taxpayer, they lied to Congress. And they did so under oath. Mr. Snowden was prosecuted, but not the head of the NSA, who should be in prison, for lying to Congress under oath, saying, no, we do not do that. And he later said, well, I didn't know that we did that, which is another lie. And it's a lie because he was given the question a week in advance. So he can't say, oh, I didn't have time to prepare for this question. Like a child saying, I didn't know about the homework assignment. This is his job. So illegal spying, and in addition, what is called enhanced surveillance procedures, and illegal behavior. I'm going to focus for a moment on the United States government, but it's not the only bad player in this by any means. But it's one of the ones, because there's more openness, there's been more discussion of the criminal behavior. After the 9/11 attacks in the United States, they passed an act in Congress called USA Patriot, Uniting and Strengthening America. That's USA. Now, Patriot is providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorists. So some government bureaucrat was up all night long working out that name. And the consequence was, are you for the Patriot Act or are you not a patriot? And they voted for this act, and to their shame, most of them did not read it. They did not read it. I debated one of the advocates, a man named William Crystal, I'll talk about him in a moment, neoconservative ideologue in America, and I debated him on the question, and he said, well, I'm not an expert on the topic like Tom. And I said, you know, I just read it. That made me an expert. And he said, I don't know why you object to this. These are things prosecutors have wanted for years. And I said, that's the reason I object to it. It's one reason. It has nothing to do with defeating terrorists. It has everything to do about eliminating the rule of law. And he admitted it. He said it's something prosecutors have wanted for years, to make it easy to prosecute people. It wasn't to actually defeat terrorists. That was just an excuse to erode the rule of law. And not at all worth it. And then, in many countries, you still have some residue of conscription, the draft, the taking of your life because it doesn't belong to you. And this is quite an interesting one. In the United States, it's called the selective service system, not the universal service system. There's a reason for that. It was passed in the First World War by socialists who wanted a national labor administration to manage the national labor force, so that they could say, you're really smart, you stayed home. But Stefan Kolev, go. You're expendable. We send you to the trenches to die. But the smart people, you're going to stay. We're going to select the useless people. the Stefan Kolevs of the world. They were to be sent out to die. So this was a very much socialist approach to this, but the fundamental point is it means you belong to me as your ruler, as the president, as the head of the Selective Service Administration. You are mine. And if at 19 you do not register, it is a felony. It is a very serious crime.
Everybody had to register, and they
All-
chose the ones who are going to serve.
Yes. It's only males. And what do our socialist friends, by the way, say? Yes, that's unfair. Women should be registered also. Not, in my opinion, an improvement. The next point is war grows the state. We have seen this in every war. Randolph Bourne, the writer, 1916, understood. He said, war is the health of the state. States grow during war dramatically. They acquire all kinds of new powers. Germans have been paying for many, many, many years Bismarck's tax to finance the imperial fleet. Where is the imperial fleet, you may wonder? It ended with the German Empire. But that tax did not end. And on and on and on. It's what is called a ratchet effect. If you pump something up, it goes up. It might fall down, but never as low as it was. It always goes up, back, and so on. And we see this in every major crisis or war. The state's powers move up, they come down afterwards, but never to what they were before. So it is constantly pumping the state upward. Now there's another very important point. People tell us war is good for the economy. It was said for many years, what got America out of the Great Depression? Why, the war. It was the Great War, World War II. That's bad economics, bad social science, and nonsense. War is destruction. It destroys human lives, hopes, families, but also wealth and prosperity. As Robert Higgs, the economic historian, demonstrated in the Journal of Economic History, in the United States, the Great Depression did not end until after the war was over. During the war, there was a lot of automobile production, not one automobile for civilian use. They were all sent to Europe and Asia. They were all war chariots, if you will. This is not economic growth. Now, it may be that you need to go to war to avoid invasion, to defeat a dangerous enemy. Okay. But don't think, oh, how great, now we'll be richer. Making bombs and using them to blow up other people does not make you any richer. Maybe you have to do that on some occasion, if you have to defend yourself. But that's the justification. Don't think, wow, we got to make a lot of bombs. Think how rich we are now. We got to make bombs and blow them up, and then we get to make more and blow them up too. This will not make you rich, trust me. It's bad economics. But it's what our Keynesian friends have been promoting for years. In fact, here's a fun thing to do. Go to youtube.com and type the following words. Paul Krugman, alien invasion. And you will see Paul Krugman, along with Kenneth Rogoff, a professor of economics at Harvard University. And just look at Kenneth Rogoff's face when Paul Krugman says this. It's just precious. Krugman says, what we need is more spending to get out of this recession. How would you get that? It would be best if we had an alien invasion of Earth. We'd have to spend a lot of money. That would get us out of the recession. And it's so insane, Rogoff is just shocked at this insanity coming out of him. So we all understand alien invasion of Earth by cannibalistic aliens would be bad. Would not be good for the economy. There's a chapter in this little book I highly recommend by Dr. Emmanuel Martin. Some of you may know him. He's a French economist with Institute of Economic Studies Europe, on Jean-Baptiste Say. Jean-Baptiste Say is one of the most important economists. When I was first introduced to him, when I took my very first macroeconomics class, he talked about Say's law. The professor was an old, unreconstructed Keynesian. And if Say is correct, Keynes is not. There's a very important issue here. But he said, Say's law of markets says, supply creates its own demand. Say never said that. He said, if what this means is, all the people who create or supply Rolls-Royce cars, very expensive car, can buy one. We know this is not true, therefore Say is wrong. And I was only 16 years old, but I thought, that would be a stupid thing to believe. I wonder if Jean-Baptiste Say believed that. So I went to the library, and by the way, it's a general advice. If someone is quoted saying something really stupid, maybe the person didn't say that. Could be. But you can check on the Paul Krugman quote, by the way. It's a video. So don't take my word, read the video for it. What Say said is something very different. When you create some value, you create value to be exchanged for other value. So it's not bad for me if my neighbor becomes wealthier and I trade with my neighbor. It's good for me. My neighbor can pay more for what I have. Economic nationalism is a recipe for war. The view is, if the French become richer, the Germans are poor. If the English become richer, the French are poor. And we hear this economic nationalism in popular discourse. In the United States, they used to be angry about the Japanese. How dare they become wealthy? And then, now it's the Chinese. The argument is, if someone gets richer, you must be getting poor. That's not true. It's not true. It's bad economics. And Martin's essay in Jean-Baptiste Say explains this really, really well. I highly recommend it. So even economic nationalists in America complain about the Canadians becoming wealthier. I think that's the last line. How dare you do that? How could anyone get angry at Canadians? If you look at the American map, there's 4,000 miles of undefended border. And north of it are millions of nice people. They're the nicest people in the world. Why should you be angry that they become wealthier? But these small-hearted economic nationalists are angry. Well, I don't think we should be. Liberals are not like that. Two reasons. One, it is a sign of bad moral character to want other people to suffer. That's very important. Second, it's really stupid. It's even against your own interest. If you're a salesperson in a store, which would you rather have come in? A completely bankrupted person with no money, or someone who just got paid? Generally, the second one is a better customer, the one who's wealthier. So, economic nationalism is a big mistake. Countries, persons, neighbors, towns can prosper at the same time. The prosperity of one is a cause of the prosperity of the other if they trade. Now I'll come back to this, why trade is so very important. Now I mentioned also, for some of the Americans, they think if you're for peace, they become accustomed to thinking, you must be a long-haired hippie. So I mentioned, and there's a chapter by Professor Robert McDonald from the United States Military Academy at West Point, teaches at the military academy, very good libertarian, about one of the first hippies, George Washington. Right, long hair, obviously a leftist. And he considered war to be a plague. He wanted to get rid of it. He had to fight in the war, even a war for independence. And he said, this is nothing we should want other people to have to do. He was so happy when the war was over, he famously then presented his sword and resigned his commission. He resigned from office twice. He was famous for resigning. Because he said, I don't want this power. I was willing to serve in the war. He received no pay. He lost a great deal of his money. He had bullet holes in his coat from having been fired at by British troops. When the war was over, he said, thank God it is over. Here is my sword. I don't want any more. War was a plague. And James Madison, the founder of the author of the American Constitution, understood very clearly, of all the enemies of public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ, or the seed, of every other. Every enemy of liberty is found in war. And Madison was very, very concerned about making it difficult to go to war. Now, we might think that anti-war movement that's been going on for thousands of years, that's actually not true. For a long time, war was celebrated. The heroic virtues. Business was looked down on. Business people. To be a true man was to be a warrior. Heraclitus of Ephesus put it very neatly, war is the father of all and king of all. The whole world was shaped by war. Unsurprisingly, Nazi philosophers such as Martin Heidegger were infatuated with this quotation. In his 1930s lectures, he goes on and on about this, how wonderful it was. That war was the height of human existence. And there were people who celebrated it. Joseph de Maistre, one of the most despicable reactionaries of the 19th century. He called war the habitual state of mankind, which is to say, human blood must flow without interruption somewhere or other on the globe. For every nation, peace is only a respite, a pause, a short break. It's been called also the hydraulic theory of war, that if war diminishes here, it must be going up somewhere else. That there's a constant amount of violence in humanity. It turns out, and I'll talk a moment about this, that's not true. It is factually erroneous and easy to check. We are living, despite what we see in the newspapers, in probably the most peaceful period in human history. It doesn't feel like it. Because every time you turn on the television or open the newspaper, there's an image of someone being killed. But the fact is, as they say in the news business, if it bleeds, it leads. If there's blood, it goes on TV. Or it's on the front page of the newspaper. I've never seen a headline that said, yesterday, 7 billion people went about their business and did not hurt each other. It's not news. But someone killing someone on the planet is news. But if you look at the big picture and look at the statistics, the likelihood of dying from violence is at the lowest point in all of human history. Something to celebrate. The hydraulic theory, this theory is incorrect, not just on some theoretical level. As a factual matter, it is proven wrong. Now, there were, of course, in history, some people who spoke out for peace. But a movement for peace is a uniquely modern phenomenon. And that's called liberalism. It's a philosophy of peace about peaceful interaction with other people. Not only between states, but between human beings. To be at peace with your neighbors and with others. And it focused on the institutions that would make peaceful coexistence possible. Property rights, religious freedom, separation of church and state, freedom of trade. These are all institutional mechanisms to reduce conflict among human beings. Now, the key distinction, something that I was thinking a lot about the last couple of years, and then I discovered Frederick Bastiat already said it more elegantly. This is often the case. If you read Frederick Bastiat, he was so important and deep. He saw a difference between liberalism and all the other, what we would call today, ideologies. Liberalism understood, or liberals understood, there is conflict in the world and there is violence. It's a problem we want to reduce by moral norms, by social, political, legal institutions. We know there's violence and conflict. We want to find ways to reduce it and increase voluntary cooperation. In contrast, the collectivists, as he said, have found fundamental antagonisms everywhere. And here's some of his list: property owner and worker, capital and labor, common people and bourgeoisie, native born and foreign. They see the world as completely permeated, saturated, filled with conflict, or what he called fundamental antagonism. And he said liberals don't see the world that way. They do see antagonisms, but they say let's find ways to reduce them rather than celebrate them. Ayn Rand understood very neatly the difference between war and statism. She distinguished the trader, the one who trades in the market, and the warrior, the one who fights with violence. They have been fundamental antagonists throughout history. Trade does not flourish on battlefields. Factories do not produce under bombardments. Profits do not grow on rubble. Capitalism is a society of traders. Free market capitalism, we should add, for which it has been denounced by every would-be gunman who regards trade as selfish and conquest as noble. The morality of the business person, of the trader, versus the morality of the warrior. And the warrior mentality is always held up as somehow higher, and that the merchant view is lower, which a view she did not hold, of course. Now, you might think, is anyone actually for war? War is just an unfortunate thing we stumble into. Who's for it? Actually, there are people who are in favor of war, quite openly. You would be wrong if you thought there were none. And I'd like to introduce you to one of the most influential thinkers of the last 100 years. His name was Carl Schmitt. He was a very dashing and handsome German law professor. Here he is with his equally dashing and handsome good friend Ernst Junger. You may notice the context. Junger was at this time top official in military intelligence in the occupation of Paris. Very enthusiastic Nazi, and author of a very good book, I should say, called In Stahlgewittern, in the Storm of Steel, about the First World War. In it, he celebrated war. He said it was wonderful. And he described his experience in the war of killing other people, and he said, it is not every generation that is so favored. Quite a striking thing to read. Now, I should mention another writer about World War I, Erich Maria Remarque, maybe known to some of you, who wrote Im Westen nichts Neues, All Quiet on the Western Front, which presents the pointlessness, the suffering of the war, as seen by the average soldier. Very different perspective. Remarque was a liberal, and Junger was an everything but liberalism statist. He was in favor of the Soviet Union. As he famously said, they didn't have a constitution, but they had a plan. That was a great thing. They had a plan. And then he was a National Socialist, a Nazi, and at the end of his life he was a Green. It was anything but liberalism. By the way, the modern German Green Party is not so bad as it was in his time. It's much more free market and liberal today. In this very important book, this book is footnoted constantly. Most people are a little ashamed to cite Schmitt because he was a Nazi. Because he organized the attempt to expel not only the Jews from German academia, he proposed going through all German books and removing Jewish ideas, whatever that means. So he was a really, in my opinion, a very bad man. So they're a little embarrassed to quote him, but you find him in the footnotes all the time, on the far left and the far right. In this book, The Concept of the Political, he said that what makes politics possible is the distinction between the friend and the enemy. You cannot have friends if you don't have enemies. That's his view. The only way to have friends is when you have an enemy. And an enemy is not just someone you don't like. It's not the neighbor whose dog barks all night. An enemy is a fighting collectivity of people whom you are willing to kill. That's what the enemy is. Not the irritating neighbor or the ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend or anything like that. It's an enemy, one fighting collectivity of people confronting a similar collectivity. And this is a very intelligent attack on liberalism. Actually, I recommend reading it. It's a very intelligent attack on liberalism. He understood liberalism to some extent, and he attacks Schumpeter, Oppenheimer, and other liberal-minded people. But this book, this notion of antagonism as central to political life, has become extremely influential. Not just on the far right, crazy people like Alexander Dugin, who was an authentic National Socialist Nazi in Moscow State University, but Slavoj Žižek, some of you may know, he's the most famous Marxist and circus clown in Europe today. He's just an absurd character, in my opinion. He celebrates violence. And just as a side, he told not too long ago an American journalist the following. Hitler's problem was he was not violent enough. And the journalist sort of went all white and said, what? What? He said, oh, you have to understand, typical postmodern extremist, you have to realize what I mean by violence. Okay? He said, Mahatma Gandhi was more violent than Hitler. Okay? What does it mean? Well, he won against the British. So violence means winning. Interesting approach to language. The big problem was, he was in India very recently, interviewed at the Times of India, and he said, Gandhi's problem was he wasn't violent enough. He should have been more like Hitler. He seemed unaware they have the internet in India, and the journalist in America found the interview in India and said, Hitler should have been more like Gandhi, and Gandhi should have been more like Hitler, because neither one was violent enough. Okay.
So it's like Hitler at the end.
Yes. Ultimately, what he was celebrating was Hitler. And what he said was that as a leftist Schmittian, a leftist position should insist on the unconditional primacy of the inherent antagonism as constitutive of the political. The conflict between rich and poor, bourgeois and proletariat, black and white, Christian and Jew, or Christian and Muslim, gay and straight, whatever it is, male and female, all those things he sees as inherently antagonistic. They're in conflict with each other. All of life is full of that. And he celebrates it. That's politics. As opposed to looking for ways to reduce conflict between religions, between genders, and so on. But I'll return to the United States. Some of the heirs of Carl Schmitt are called neoconservatives in America. And they celebrated war also. This man, I mentioned, I debated him. He wrote that the Americans should embrace the policy of national greatness. This is called national greatness conservatism. Oh, we don't need this pursuit of happiness. That's un-American. It's in the American Declaration of Independence, but whatever. What we need is national greatness, building giant pyramids in Illinois, like the Egyptians. You can fly over and see the pyramids of Kansas, or the Great Wall of Michigan, keeping out all those horrible Canadian huge wall across the Canadian border. And then this was a call for war. He said, restore a sense of the heroic. This was the reason to invade Iraq, to be heroic. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. I feel so heroic now. And of course, these guys didn't do any of the fighting. We call them armchair generals or laptop bombers. And of course, the Iraq invasion turned out to be a spectacular success. Iraq today is a thriving, liberal democratic market economy society of prosperity. It's like Southern California. It's amazing how wonderful Iraq is. Thank you, gentlemen, for what you did. But the next lesson is a bit related to this. Foreign interventionism does not pay. Someone benefits from it. Somebody gets the contract for war, or gets to become Viceroy of India, or something like that. Somebody benefits from it. But does the society as a whole benefit? The answer is no. This is a factual matter. Adam Smith was one of the early anti-imperialists. You wouldn't know that from reading people like Slavoj Žižek, but if you read Adam Smith, he wrote what Žižek would call a text. We call a book. And he explained that in Britain's wars for the American colonies, they acquired a giant debt, and he noted that just the interest on the debt every year, the interest payment, was greater than the volume of all the trade done by British merchants with the colonies. Not even just greater than the profit, greater than the total value of the trade. So the British taxpayers were paying for this. They were not gaining from those wars. British economic growth made possible the wars. The wars did not make the economic growth possible. It's a very important distinction. The most extensive study of the British Empire by Professors Davis and Huttenbach pointed out the empire was a costly drain on the British taxpayers. They did not benefit from this. There were people who did, but the British people as a whole lost. Now Lenin, in his book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, had to, as we say, mess with the figures to argue that imperialism was somehow good for the imperial nations. This is simply not the case. Factually incorrect. If you look at the actual expenditures, there was a vast outflow of resources from the British tax-paying population. What about war for oil? We hear this, it's in the back of most conversations about the Middle East. We don't want to say it, but we have to keep military force there for the oil. Secretary of State James Baker mentioned this in the first Iraq War. Isn't that shameful? It's the first and the second Iraq War. He said, it is about a dictator, Saddam Hussein, who acting alone could strangle the global economic order. His suggestion was, if they stopped allowing the oil export, the economy would be destroyed. The Keynot Institute did a study on this. Even if you assume Saddam Hussein was really stupid, he wasn't. He was bad, but not stupid. And he didn't want to sell the oil, which was not the case. He wanted to sell the oil because he's smart enough to know it tastes terrible. You actually drink oil, it's awful. You only get value if you sell it to someone, which is why Hugo Chavez, the now dead dictator of Venezuela, sold all of his oil to the United States. As he said, evil Yankee imperialists, and all of the oil was sold to America. Well, obviously. He wanted the best price. At Keynot, they did a simple study. They said, what would be the harm to the American economy alone if the oil were to stop flowing through the Straits of Hormuz? Here's what would happen. This is what surprised all the leftists. The price would go up. Wow, the price would go up, and then you would have to substitute. You'd have to use less oil, find other substitutes like shale gas and other things would become economical. What would be the total welfare loss to the entire economy? He calculated that. Then he said, okay, that would be a loss. what is the cost of the military commitment we're currently spending on? Because Secretary Baker assumed it was zero. It's not. I don't know if any of you have ever bought an aircraft carrier. They're really expensive. My last one, I was in mortgage for years. So those things are expensive. Add up the cost of the military, it was much larger than the worst case scenario of a stupid dictator who wanted to bankrupt himself. So this is just not true. But moreover, oops, what we got here? Oh, it's the NSA again.
Did they implant the camera in your cat's eye?
That's a picture I took. I woke up to go to the airport at 3:30 in the morning, and she looked at me, she said, "Why are you awake now?" I took a picture of her. There we go. Blaine Niskanen, since passed away, was chairman of the Keynot Institute, and he was on the President's Council of Economic Advisors under President Reagan. He debated the former CIA director, James Woolsey, about the second Iraq war. Woolsey said, we have to take out Saddam Hussein. And one of the arguments was the oil. And Niskanen destroyed him in the debate. He was a very moral person. He went to church, he was a very serious Christian. But he said, I'm going to set aside all my moral concerns and just talk as an economist for a moment. Oil is a commodity. The price of oil in Japan is the same as the price in Britain, which surprises non-economists. They don't understand markets. It's a commodity. Japan does not produce any oil, but the price of oil is the same as it is in Norway, which produces a lot of oil, because it's a global market. If they don't sell it to us, they'll sell it to someone else. It's a fungible commodity. One unit is roughly the same as another. And he said, oil is not worth a war. It isn't worth it. It's a bad calculation, even only economically, setting aside other moral considerations about human life. If all you're concerned is euros, he explained, don't go to war for oil. Professor Eric Gardsky in the book from UC San Diego explains very neatly the role of trade. The decline in violence, this is a European conflicts, even taking into account the great wars of the last century. And the good news is, world per capita GDP, you'll notice the average polity score, which is the amount of democratic accountability and governance, declined for a while after 1950 because of decolonization. There are more countries in the world, many of them with not very good governance, but then recovered, began to climb again. And the good news again, exports around the world. This is a very, very good thing if you believe in peace. If you want to support peace, you should love freedom of trade. And we've tried to explain this to our leftist friends, that all sentiment aside, free trade is one of the most important elements in bringing about peace between nations. Now, in the book, I also interviewed a businessman. He's a wonderful man named Chris Rupert, and he processes tomatoes. These are billions of tomatoes that have been slapped constantly, as you see here, and they're being turned into pizzas. And he trades with the whole world. And I said, you sell to foreigners? He says, yes, but I don't think of them that way. I think of them as customers. And he said, when you see other people as customers, it doesn't really occur to you to want to shoot them. That's a very important point. If you want to ask who are the greatest creators of peace in the world, is it college professors? No. It's business people. It's traders. They create peace. Same thing with religious toleration. It wasn't college professors who brought us religious freedom, it was business people. In the Netherlands, one of the great pioneers of religious freedom, when King Philip II of Spain attempted to introduce in the 16th century the Inquisition and burn people to death, the merchants of Antwerp, the business council, sent a letter. They said, "Oh, most gracious and wonderful king, we think you're really great. By the way, please do not introduce the Inquisition here. So many heretics and infidels come here to trade, it will ruin us." They understood the first thing you learn in business school. If you burn your customers alive, you will not get the second sale. If you support peace, you should support freedom of trade. Now, Steven Pinker, one of the contributors to the book, this book I highly recommend. It's a very difficult book. It's lots of statistics and history and psychology in the book. He's a professor of psychology at Harvard. He says, believe it or not, and most people do not, violence has declined. And he demonstrates it. It's a really quite remarkable book. And then he says, we can ask why it declined. And we can learn the lessons if we want to make violence decline further in the future. So let me begin to wrap up. This has been known for a long time. There was a great poet named Homer. He has a television show many young people watch today. And in one of his older poems, called the Odyssey, he wrote about the Cyclops. And this is an old drawing of him. The eye is the key here. The Cyclops is not nice. When Odysseus and his men come to the island, the Cyclops attacks them and eats them. Not nice. And Odysseus is fighting him, and he asks him, what gift will you give us for landing on the island? It was traditional among the Greeks. If you land on my island, I give you gifts of water and food. You can go on your way. I might land on your island someday. Reciprocity would work. And the Cyclops says, I will eat you last. If you make a ranking of gifts, this is very low. But then it asks, why is the Cyclops so savage? And Homer's answer is interesting. The Cyclops have no ships with crimson prows. That's the front part of the ship. No shipwrights. These are builders of ships. There to build them good, strong craft that could sail them out to foreign ports of call, as most men risk the seas to trade with other men. The Cyclops is uncivilized and savage because he does not trade with anyone else. He lives in the ideal world of the anti-globalization movement. All production and all consumption is local. He's a locavore, as they call them. Now, as we know, right now, everyone is focused on Ukraine and what has happened there. These are Ukrainian self-defense militias in Crimea, which Mr. Putin later admitted were all Russian special forces. And having told us, no, there are no Russian special forces, he then just very openly admitted in July, oh yes, these were all units of the special forces of the Russian Federation. This is from a recent art exhibit in Moscow. Quite beautiful. Great man. This is the Crimean coat of arms here. Quite a celebration. What we've seen also taking place not too far from here, quite frankly, horrific violence. And this is taking place in a European country quite close to us right now. This is the Donetsk airport, which used to be actually a pretty nice airport. I don't think anyone's flying in the near future. So what to do about this? I do think there is a possibility that we should avoid of a war. And we might focus on what that would mean and why it's so important to do everything to avoid that. With cooler heads, avoiding the mentality of glory, the wonderfulness of fighting against enemy nations. And so the question is, who's going to stand up for peace? And I do encourage some of you, if you speak English, Russian, or Ukrainian, the Students for Liberty is having a special summit in Ukraine, which will be in 3 languages. It will be in Russian, Ukrainian, and English. There will be many Russians there. It's difficult for them now to go to Ukraine because when they go back to Russia, they get arrested, which is what happened to some of the Students for Liberty members from Russia. When they returned to Russia, they said, "What were you doing in Ukraine?" They said, "I was visiting friends," and then they get to visit with FSB friends. Ours as well. Now, I want to end with one thought, and that is what all of you are inheritors of. There's a big tradition of liberty. And if you think of some of the great figures of this tradition, images that are probably familiar to you of previous generations, of different writers, some of you may know, this is Ayn Rand, this is Rose Ronda Lane, really wonderful libertarian writer, 1940s. And this last century, more familiar figures, Rose Friedman, Milton Friedman, Robert Nozick. But I want to introduce you to a friend of mine, who's my teacher. A little emotional. I was with him when he died a few days ago. His name was Leonard Litchfield. And all my life that I have known Leonard, I calculated 38 years. And learned an enormous amount from him. He's a great scholar, a wonderful, gentle, kind person, very helpful to many different people. But something that we should remember about old people. They weren't always old. It's obvious when you think about it, but we have to focus on that. Leonard was the first Student for Liberty that I know. This is Leonard when he was a very young man. This is Murray Rothbard, some of you may know. And when he was in high school and then college, he set out Libertarian Club. And if you think about it, you think libertarianism is considered an unusual view today. This is 1951 when he set up his Libertarian Club. And he had a great influence on huge numbers of people. Modern libertarian thought owes a great deal to him. His deep historical understanding, his personal kindness. When he died, we got letters from Turkey, from Turkish libertarians who had learned and been inspired by him. The Turkish libertarian movement owes a great deal to this man. From Morocco, from Hong Kong, China, from really all over the world, from Guatemala, and Argentina, and Mexico, for this great person. And these are very big shoes to fill. So, when he was in college, he was just like you. He just passed away on Tuesday. If any of us have the impact this man had, the world would be a much, much better world when we are 80 years old as well. So I'll just conclude with the words of Frederick Bastiat when he was asked in the Assemblée Nationale, "What is your plan, Monsieur Bastiat? You're always so negative about our plans. What do you propose?" Liberty within, peace without. This is the entire plan. That's our plan. Thank you.
Well, we can do some questions. A few of them, yeah, I can see hands already.
My name is Dylan. I'm very curious if all things you said today in the context of the hybrid world, when it's undeclared, when you don't have the patches and still there's aggression and annexations. how do countries respond to that? That's my first question. And the second is, we all know the link here, the audience here. We know the link trade improves peace. But what do you think about the current strategy of economic sanctions to sort of roll back the war?
Okay, let me start with the second question. I don't think sanctions have a very good track record. They don't work, with a few exceptions. For instance, the U.S. embargo on Cuba was tremendously successful since Fidel Castro was forced out in 1965. And since then, Cuba has been a free country, right? Obviously not. This is a complete and total failure. The Cuban embargo is a total failure. And all it did was it made the Cuban dictatorship stronger, because they could blame all their problems on this embargo. Cuba can trade with all the world. So they buy everything they want from Mexico, Canada, whatever, other countries. But it's a failure because they don't produce anything there. It's a communist economy, so big surprise, very poor. But the embargo has actually strengthened the regime. It did the same thing with Saddam Hussein. Because when the state had this control, there was an embargo, they had more control over the economy. You only got cooking oil and rice if you followed the rules of the state and you were rationed. And otherwise, you didn't. So it actually made the state's grip stronger, not weaker. In the case of the current sanctions, these were generally targeted against named individuals. And most of those named individuals, maybe all, but I'll say at least most, are indeed thuggish criminals. These are not nice people. They already liquidated all of their assets outside of Russia. When a politician says, if you do this, I'll put sanctions on you, don't do that, I'll sanction you, what do people do? They sell all their stuff. In October of last year, they began liquidating. This is why I think this was planned quite some time ago. October, 1 year ago, Russian oligarch, or whatever we want to call them, cronies, began liquidating Western assets. In February, before the Crimean occupation, all of the top officers of Gazprom liquidated 100% of their shares. They got the memo from the Kremlin. So they're not stupid. They anticipated this and made themselves immune to harm. President Putin said, this is going to happen. There may be sanctions on you. Take preventive action. So they all went into Bitcoin or whatever they did with their resources. And so there's nothing to do to harm them. Then the Russian government, President Putin, just imposed sanctions on Polish apples and German strawberries and so on, which are actually additional sanctions on all the Russian population. But he's blaming it on you bad Europeans. Well, these are all Kremlin decisions. Generally, sanctions don't work, and I'm against them. What I would rather see, I think would actually be more helpful, eliminate visa requirements for Ukrainians and Russians to come to Europe and the United States and Canada. Let them come. Show to the actual people of the countries, we are not your enemies. You can come here. We're not going to put restrictions on you. If you want to put sanctions on some cronies, okay, 100 people. But why lead to sanctions on the whole population? This is very harmful. With regard to the other question, let me give you two elements of it. First thing is, you didn't ask, but it's connected. I'm against what they call the war on terror. And not because I'm in favor of terrorists. You want it very clear, I'm against terrorists. But you cannot wage war on a tactic. Terror is not a person or a state. It's not the Third Reich, it's not ISIS, it's a tactic. And you can't wage war on it. How would we know when we win the war on terror? It's a recipe for an endless war. So I think it's a dig mistake. This question, though, of soldiers without uniforms and so on, what to do? And I wish I knew the answer precisely. In Ukraine, there's terrible fighting. It's actually still going on. There's a kind of ceasefire, but in eastern Ukraine, there is still blood is flowing right now. We know that Ukraine has been invaded by the Kremlin. They keep picking idiots as their press spokesman. So first they have Strelkov, so-called, and Borodai, both of whom admit on television that they're FSB agents. Not smart. And they're not even Ukrainians. They're both from Moscow. Unsurprisingly, they were called back to Moscow. And we haven't heard from them since. So then they installed another idiot with a Ukrainian name, Zakharchenko. And he goes on television and is asked by a journalist, are there Russian military units? He says, no, but there are between 3,000 and 4,000 active duty Russian soldiers here, but they're all on vacation. He says, instead of being with their families, they're here with us. Well, this is, again, stupid. So I don't know how long he's going to last. Finally, they'll get someone who graduated public relations training, who knows how to lie convincingly. I think that the Ukrainian situation is really dangerous. Number one, don't do anything stupid. Mr. Putin, in my opinion, is a psychopath. He'll kill you as soon as look at you, if it's useful to him. He already threatened nuclear war over Donbass. When Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who was authentically insane, stated in the parliament, in the Duma, he called for nuclear strikes on the Baltic states and Poland. And President Putin said, oh please, no. But we should remind the world we are a first-class armed nuclear power. It is wise not to interfere with us. I'm not making a threat, it's just a fact, which is the most effective way to make a threat. It's a clear threat. And when he's told that there could be tanks in Warsaw, he said, oh, I'm just saying a fact. But it is a threat. So we should be aware he's extremely dangerous. Very dangerous person. We should also be aware that there's very active Kremlin infiltration of European political movements. Extreme, far-right, xenophobic, hateful, anti-Semitic movements like Jobbik are connected to the Kremlin in Hungary. This is a really scary Nazi party. They don't even hide it anymore when they called for a list of all the Jews in the country to be drawn on. In Hungary, which had such a horrible Holocaust in 1945. Front National, which is not quite so evil as Jobbik, but pretty evil. And their anti-Semitic nature came out also when the father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, stated after the election victory against a Jewish critic, a journalist, he said, it's hard to translate from the French, but he said, I'll make a bread loaf of you in the oven. And said to a Jew, this has a very clear, unmistakable meaning. It was very direct in French. It's hard to translate, but it's really evil. And his daughter, the leader, said, Papa, on the whole killing and cooking Jew jokes. And other parties like that. And I think we should be aware that there is an active infiltration by the Kremlin of European and other countries also, political movements promoting extreme, fascist-oriented, anti-trade, anti-liberal, anti-Semitic, all those antis movements. And I think that needs to be openly exposed and combated because it's a new fascist threat to liberalism that's emerged that shocked me. I would not have expected this 5 years ago. This is a real shock to see fascism reappearing in Europe.
Okay, more questions? More questions?
Don't you think there is such infiltration in the United States based on the fact that the two administrations of George W. Bush and the two administrations of Obama have done anything possible to destroy American freedom, the liberty of freedom?
Well, I wouldn't call it an infiltration because it wasn't sponsored by some foreigners. These were domestic American stupid people. We have them also. We harvest them like vast crops of stupid people. But maybe stupid isn't the right word. There are people who think you can build a house taller by taking bricks from the foundation. And they don't understand that when you get rid of the rule of law and protection of property, you're taking the bricks from the base of the house, thinking will make it taller. And this is not a wise approach. So that is just normal American politics and short-sightedness, not thinking about the consequences. So it has nothing to do with an infiltration. It is a domestic but very serious problem, and I'll give you two examples. I believe very strongly in the rule of a constitution, the rule of law, whatever we call it. The British don't have a written constitution, but they have a constitution. It's just up here in some sense. It's in their hearts. They don't write it down. Written constitutions have some advantages and some disadvantages. President Bush was reported to have said, when the discussion of the Guantanamo Bay, the Guantanamo base, which was illegal in my opinion, what they did, it was illegal. His own legal advisors from the Justice Department said, Mr. Bush, Mr. President, what you're proposing is illegal. It was reported, probably by Andrew Card, his chief of staff, who resigned after this, that he said, why do you keep throwing the Constitution in my face? It's just a piece of paper. That made me very upset. It isn't just a piece of paper. It's the laws by which the state is required to obey them. And if you lose that, you're in a lawless state. And then President Obama has said effectively the same thing. I can put the nation at war without consulting Congress. This is just outrageous. The Constitution explicitly denies that. And the spying scandal is explicitly illegal. So there's a great debate in the U.S. about restoring limits on the authority, especially the executive branch of the presidency. And we're very much a part of that debate in the United States. Students for Liberty is a part of that. It's really important.
One final question for Dr. Palmer.
Hello, thank you first for sharing your thoughts and experience. I have a question about a situation in the world that happens right now. What do you think about the situation with Islamic nation?
With what?
Islamic nation.
Islamic State.
How the world should react and how can we handle this?
Okay. So everyone understood it's about what used to be called ISIS or ISIL and now is called IS. Sounds even more terrible. There are a couple of quick things to be said about it. One, it's one of the consequences of earlier foolish interventions. The American and British European invasion of Iraq was foolish because they thought that the natural equilibrium state of humanity is basically Belgium or the Netherlands. Pick some fairly peaceful place, the Dutch. And that the only thing that keeps you from being there is a dictator stopping you. Get rid of the dictator and everyone lives in the Netherlands. Right? This is not true. Constitutional liberalism is a historical achievement. It's very rare in human history. It's just the blink of an eye in human history. And you have to understand what makes it possible. And usually it is not delivered by bombs or tanks. It's not a way to deliver a constitutional regime of freedom. So that was a mistake. Let's not make the same mistake with more invasions. This is not going to go well. ISIS, or IS, is such a virulently hateful and evil group. They have generated a lot more opposition. When you execute 1,700 soldiers who surrendered to you, what are the next soldiers going to say? Never surrender to ISIS, right? If you do, they'll just kill you. They videotaped it. I have a very strong stomach for this. I go to Iraq, I go to Afghanistan. I'm aware that if they catch me, they'll cut my head off. So I watched how they do that. Just because I wanted to be ready if it ever happens to me. I don't want to say, whoa, I didn't know that would happen. I want to know, if you're going to go to a place like that, don't have illusions. These are really shocking, horrifying, bad people. And they have now created a pretty common front against them. You have to be insane to surrender to people like that. You would fight to the death. So I think this is a kind of a virus that's going to kill itself off. It's going to be the people in the neighborhood who do the job. Should the United States invade? No. I'm very much against that. I think it would only make things worse. We're already seeing this complex situation is changing in ways no one would have anticipated. The Turkish government just bombed the allies of the Kurds who are fighting against ISIS in Kobane on the border. Who's fighting against who in this war right now? It's so complicated. It's Turkey against Iran, fighting against Assad, but also fighting against the Islamists supported by Qatar, who are fighting against him. It's almost impossible to understand, and consequently, it's impossible to predict what's going to happen.
But Toyota is selling cars to all of them.
Sorry?
Toyota is selling cars to all of them.
These are used cars. You will not find any Toyota dealerships. I don't think that's true. What we have seen, though, is that when these U.S. and Saudi and United Arab Emirates and British and French strikes, you know what they're blowing up? American tanks that were given to the Iraqi army and abandoned and are now occupied by insane, crazy people, motivated by a crazy ideology. The last point is very important. When we say Islamic State, we should be very careful not to say Islam. That's really important. Who are the biggest victims of these extremists? It's Muslims. It's libertarian, liberal-minded Muslims who want to live at peace are the ones they're murdering by the thousands. And we have to stand with our Muslim friends who are really the biggest victims of these monsters. And make a very strong effort that we stand with our friends in the Muslim world who are standing up against this kind of insanity and violence. That, to me, is also a very important part of a really libertarian approach to the problem. Well, thank you for your time.